joining us. Hopefully everybody can hear us just fine. So Steve and I are going to go through a presentation for you tonight. I'm going to share my screen and get us going. Okay, does that look good, Steve?
It does.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks for putting it up.
Yep, let me also get myself going here. Okay, still good?
Yeah.
Okay, so our plan for tonight is to just run through some information that's related to adolescent mental health with a particular emphasis on depression and anxiety. And given our current world in the pandemic, we are seeing a definite increase in the number of kids who are reporting symptoms consistent with both depression and anxiety. And that's not just limited to adolescents, it's also occurring in younger children and all the way through elderly and geriatric populations. Everybody is experiencing increases in these two disorders just because of the world that we have to live in and the precautions that we have to take. So tonight we're going to talk about some statistics related to adolescents. We're going to cover common signs of anxiety and depression, as well as appropriate responses that we can take, caretaking, and the role that as parents we have to make sure our kids are safe. We're going to talk a little bit about self-awareness and self-management in terms of kids tuning into themselves and some things that they can do to sort of take some control of their feelings in these kinds of situations. And then I'm going to review your helps that are available through student services. So we have a Q&A set up for during the presentation. So if somebody joins, and has a question, we'll answer the questions through a Slido, which is a new feature that we're trying tonight. So to get us started, 1 in 5 children who are ages 6 to 17, which is about 17% of youth, are experiencing a mental health condition. And on average, it takes 11 years between the time that symptoms onset and the time that somebody gets treatment. So if you have a 15-year-old in your house right now, on average, that kid will be 26 before they see their first clinician to talk about their symptoms and to seek help. And so we want to make sure that we are really tuned in to the key signs and make sure that we are able to offer appropriate help so we can dramatically reduce that. Because only 51% of kids who are ages 6 to 17 get help for a mental health condition in a given year. And so there's at least 49%, half of our kids, go untreated. And for many of them, that will go on for an average of 11 years. So during the pandemic, we have 40% of parents in the US reporting signs of distress in their children. So if you are seeing those in your kids and in your house, you are definitely not alone. I have an 8-year-old, and we have definitely seen some of the signs that are coming up here in a second in our house. And we've been trying to learn better strategies for how to cope with the restrictions and the precautions that are required when we are out and about and when we're at home. Some of the signs that have been indicated by parents on a pretty consistent basis include this list. So we've seen clinginess in 37% of kids who are reported, inattention, irritability, worry, obsessive requests for updates, fear of the death of a relative, disruptions to sleep, disruptions to appetite, fatigue, nightmares, discomfort, and agitation. And so as you might imagine, some of these things happen in isolation. So you might see one student who's clingy and another who's irritable, but very many kids are having multiple of these symptoms. And again, 40% of parents in the United States surveyed are reporting some or all of these symptoms in their kids. So kids are in distress. There's no doubt that this is a tough time and that it's extremely difficult on a good day to be an adolescent, but in the pandemic, it's even more difficult and challenging. So we're going to move into some common signs specifically of depression to start off with, and we'll also cover anxiety. So there's a book that is used by mental health providers called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It's in its 5th incarnation. It's been revised many times, dating back to the 60s or 70s, I believe. And they are the ones, it's like kind of the diagnostic tool that determines whether or not somebody is experiencing a particular mental health condition. So in order to be diagnosed with depression, You'll have to see a clinical provider, so a social worker or a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, somebody like that with a clinical diagnosis who notes in you 5 or more symptoms in the same 2-week period, with at least one of the symptoms being either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. So it could be both of those things, but it has to include one of those things, if not both. In that same 2-week period of time, we need to see depressed mood most or all of every day, nearly every day, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, or a decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day, a slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical movement, which is observable by others. It's not just that I say that I feel sluggish, it's that other people are noting a pretty distinguishable change in my behavior as compared to before the onset of symptoms. And then fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, and feelings or worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. So, continuing on, diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day. So trouble just making even easy decisions, like what am I going to eat for breakfast? That pre-onset of symptoms was never a problem, but now has shown up as a significant issue. And then recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt, or a specific plan for committing suicide. So that's the heavy hitter at the end there, where somebody has persistently felt so down and it has culminated in thoughts about death or even a plan to harm themselves. As we switch gears, so the other thing to remember is that you need to accumulate 5 or more of those symptoms within that 2-week period of time, and one of them has to include that first 1 or 2. So for anxiety, it's a little bit of a longer period of time to be tracking symptoms. For at least the previous 6 months, excessive worry or anxiety, which is like apprehensive expectation, occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about any of the events in their lives or things that are coming up, and difficulty controlling that worry. So the anxiety and worry are associated with 3 or more of the following symptoms. But here's the thing about students. It only takes 1. So you can actually be diagnosed with anxiety as a youth, a child, or an adolescent with even fewer number of these symptoms. And they need to be present more days than not in the previous 6-month period of time. So restlessness, feeling keyed up or on edge, and you might notice that as kind of like just extra energy that has nowhere to go, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, being a blank mind, or sometimes it's the racing mind that's distracting, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. The anxiety or worry or physical symptoms have to cause clinically significant distress or impairment, and they can't be attributed to any sort of substance use, or they can't be explained by a different medical disorder. So plenty of people have restless leg syndrome, and if that's a diagnosed condition, then you can't count it as an indicator of anxiety in this particular instance because it's pre-existing to the onset of symptoms. Oops, that was a previous one. Let me go to the next one. So I feel like I need to just pause and say that was a lot of information. But the thing to remember is that this might sound really familiar, like startlingly familiar, because everybody is experiencing depression and anxiety, particularly in the pandemic. Nothing feels sort of familiar or similar to anything that we had before. Certainly nothing is predictable. And so everybody's on edge and everybody is feeling keyed up and all of those different things that we're talking about. So in response to that, I just want to make sure that people know that there isn't a pervasive depressive situation right now that it will resolve, because it can be situational. It can be related to the pandemic, and when the pandemic passes and we enter phase 5 in Illinois, when things start to feel more normal, people will notice that their depressive and anxiety symptoms are going to go away. And everybody looks different. It varies based on age, varies based on gender, it varies based on personality. I mean, there are so many things that influence what anxiety feels like and looks like, and depression is the same way. So I wanted to let Steve offer his perspective as a regular ed teacher and somebody who has his own personal experiences to share with us. And I will give you the floor.
Well, thank you. Um, and so, my name is Steve Svetlik. I'm a computer science teacher at Ridgewood. Um, I've been in many different high schools. I've taught for over half my life, and I'm also a human being. And I come with my own story, as a lot of people do, and I entered this particular conversation and wanted to serve in this way, really to broadcast that this is not this is not something that should be ignored. And I'm going to speak specifically from the perspective of being a white heterosexual cisgender man. Um, there's a perspective out there that I think still continues to this point. So this is not a clinician speaking. I'm not a trained social worker on this, but there's definitely a feeling that even now in 2020, that to be strong and silent and suffering as a man is still considered good in society, and there's there's a certain perspective, a narrative, if you will, on on receiving treatment for this. So as Jen was walking through those common signs of anxiety and depression, um, I can speak personally and openly and comfortably on a recording right now, saying, yeah, I've experienced a lot of those head on. And when Jen referenced an 11-year gap, and I want to make sure that I get this right. So Jen, correct me where I don't capture this, but an 11-year gap between um, treatment, receiving treatment, and experiencing the symptoms. Would you say
Yep.
that's okay?
It's an average of 11 years. Yep.
Yeah, and that was exactly the case for me. Um, and so I speak as an adult who lost a child. My wife and I lost a child, um, and that was a very significant trauma for us. I speak as an adult who 9 months later lost my brother in a motorcycle accident. And at the time, I was working in a job that um, had a lot of pressure associated with it. I should also mention, as an adult, um, as I was diagnosed late in the high school, um, I'm an adult with ADHD, and I think that that's something that needs to be considered too. Though that the ADHD does not connect specifically to my anxiety and depression that happened due to situational events, but it definitely amplifies it. So my my story that I really want others to know is that not only is getting help after trauma a good thing, in many cases it's like the key thing to ensuring that I'm doing a good job as a parent, as a teacher, as as one who cares for others and wants to care for others. And so um, what I've experienced at times through through getting therapy and through participating in some weekend events where I would have a weekend retreat with other men. We'd learn how to communicate in a way that shows empathy. What I've gained out of that is an appreciation for just how nuanced people's lives are, and how important it is that we um, that we honor everybody's perspective before we make judgment calls. And it's really hard to do, and it takes a lot of practice. But one of the keys to working through and learning to manage anxiety and learning to manage depression is being able to find healthy outlets, um, people you can go to communicate. Now, high school students, especially those who are going through an acute trauma, like some that I've experienced, or just ongoing trauma from a host of different reasons, the pandemic being one of them. Um, it's very easy for students to bottle up. And so, being somebody who bottled up for many years in my own life, both in adolescence and in young adulthood, um, I, I can say that it's a very lonely place to be. And to the extent that um, we can work together to, and by we I mean teachers, student services professionals at Ridgewood, administration, um, parents and guardians, and students, that we can all communicate together. When we start to see some of these signs, um, we can really help take care of our students in ways that they're not going to really appreciate until they're older, but they will appreciate them. It took a few teachers when I was in high school to approach me, specifically identifying some of the common signs of depression. And this was many years before I had some um, acute tragedies in my life, right? So this has been something that I've dealt with for many years, but I don't belabor it, because in getting the treatment that I need, I feel like I can be just as healthy and productive and um, happy as other people. Um, I felt like I've gained a lot personally by seeking help from others, and that's one of the most important things I would hope. If there's only one thing that people capture from what I'm saying here, is that if you have just a suspicion that your child might be exhibiting any of these signs, um, keep a watchful eye, and don't be afraid to provide that help for your your child. Um, Jen, was there anything that you think I missed, or I could have clarified there?
Nope, you did beautifully. I actually appreciate you sharing your personal stories too, because I think that that makes a significant impact when people know that they're not alone. And I think for our kids in particular, particularly in this remote setting, everybody feels alone and isolated. And so knowing that there are people who feel familiar in whatever way it feels like to them is sometimes the start that some kids need just to even ask for help. So I very much appreciate you sharing that. I would add my own personal experience is for my 8-year-old. We started to notice in the transition from his preschool into kindergarten, which signaled a complete change of his peer group. We went from his daycare, which was close by where we worked, to his kindergarten, which is where we live. And he had to make all new friends. And he had been a part of that daycare since he was 18 months old. So he just didn't remember life without those particular kids and those particular teachers and that familiar building and all that stuff.
Mm.
And it never occurred to us that we needed to teach him how to make friends, because he just had always had friends. He'd always been part of that cohort. And when we started in kindergarten, it became obvious in about middle of October, the school hosted kind of a movie night and a pumpkin patch event. And we were there with many, many families, many of whom were from his class. And I watched him unsuccessfully try to engage several of the other kids in his class in just play. And he was that uncomfortable, awkward kid that you sometimes
Mm.
see on the playground, and he belonged to me. And I was horrified because here I am, a social worker, and I had no idea that he was struggling so significantly. And it turned out that in addition to a variety of other things that were going on, Dagan is my son. He has been diagnosed with ADHD. So that rings true in terms of what you're talking about, even if you've
Mm.
got your diagnosis older. So ADHD, anxiety, and sensory processing disorder. So my little guy comes at life with a lot of different hiccups, things that make it harder for him to navigate on a day-to-day basis. And then when you add that to the pandemic, we've seen a lot of those symptoms that you're talking about with the anxiety and with the depression. He's young to get a diagnosis of depression, but I will say this, he's definitely irritable. He's definitely distracted, and that's a function of the ADHD, but also just
Mm.
his brain, it goes and goes and goes. So I think that your advice about seeking help is really pertinent and very, very important. And it's not going to look the same for everyone. And everybody has a baseline on who their kids are, right? You've known them since whenever, and you know what their normal looks like. And so some kids are going to run slow in the mornings, and some kids are going to run quick tempered or tightly wound. There's a personality component to this. It's when they sort of slide off of that baseline and you start to see new things or more intense things that you hadn't noticed before that raise a red flag, that it's worth sort of pausing and saying, what am I noticing that is concerning, and in what way is it concerning? So I wanted to, go ahead.
No, I feel I need to just piggyback off of that. I'm
Yeah,
also,
for sure.
so we were blessed with uh, two other children. Uh, Jonathan, my younger son, who likes to draw hearts with smiley faces inside of them in crayon one moment, and the next moment he's just tearing up the house. My daughter, who is 5 years old, going on 18,
Mm.
seems to be standing for justice quite a bit, and I don't even think she knows what that means yet. But it's just funny. Yeah, there are definitely, speaking now as a parent and just listening to your story. There are certain things I've noticed as my children get older, even in the midst of a busy day, in the midst of all that's going on, where I can pick up on something, but I don't quite have an idea of what it is or how to
Mm-hmm.
unpack it. And I heard that really broadcast well, and what you're saying, and it's about listening to my intuition, and
Mm-hmm.
that's generated some good conversations, with my spouse, and um, part of it is just naming it, and naming it in a healthy way, and trying to avoid calling calling out any change in behavior. When I'm having a conversation with my spouse, I'm going to try to do so away from the children, because
Sure.
even though they are 4 and 5
Yep.
and we've been able to talk for a while, sort of in adult,
Parent.
yeah,
Right.
in parent. I was going to say tongues, but in parent, you know, I mean, they pick up on more than I've learned. I've been surprised a few times.
They're little
Um,
sponges. It's crazy.
but there's something that I'm also, I just, and this is taken away a little bit from the next slide here, but
Sure.
there was, um, there's something that I want to put out there, both again as an adult, as a teacher, um, but also as a man in a world where there's often a lot of stereotypes still placed upon young men that get carried over into adulthood, and there's probably something to be said about some of the problems that we're seeing societally based on this very thing. Um, but the ability just to listen to your child is so critical. And I mean, this is in the midst of what I'm sure is a busy day for anybody who happens to be hearing us. Thank you for listening if you are hearing us right now. But just just carving out that time when it feels like there's a million things going on. I can tell you from experience, sometimes the anxiety can be really uh, I don't know the right word, deflated. It can really
Yeah.
dissipate when I just have the ability to get whatever story I might have in my head or recurring thought I might have in my head out to somebody else who's going to listen.
Hmm. That's
And
very true.
and I mean, again, I'm looking at the next slide as we haven't shown it yet. There it is. It's up there. Offer unconditional love and support. As hard as it is, and yeah, these are definitely high school students, and high school students are um, their job is to test independence sometimes because they want to know if you really care, and sometimes really caring means to lay down the law a little bit. But at the end of the day, if they know that you're doing so because you love them unconditionally and you're willing to support them, um, that's everything.
Hmm.
That's all of it. I think that's the whole
The whole
right there.
piece. Yep, absolutely. I would just add that I have discovered in my 20 plus years of working with adolescents that sometimes parallel conversations work better. So we're trained to square up and have face to face, talking back and forth. But sometimes if you're facing forward, and so this position might look familiar when you're driving in the car, when you're playing a video game, if you're making dinner together and you both are chopping vegetables for a salad, you might find that sometimes information comes more easily when they're not obligated to look you right in the eye, because sometimes there's a sense of stigma and shame that accompanies these feelings. And particularly if you're measuring yourself, which is, a function of adolescence, against the next 10 kids that who are your same age and same gender and same grade and all these other things, and they don't seem to be struggling the way that you are. Sometimes the internalized message is that you're flawed or you're broken or there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to then articulate, though, because it's already awkward enough to be adolescent, and then on top of it to be a different or broken adolescent is particularly challenging. And so what I have found, sometimes I keep in my office, when we're actually able to be in the office, I have a whole basket of fidgets. I have games that we can play. So I've played, I can't even count, millions of games of Uno or Jenga, because it means that there's something in between us that we can focus on without having to make that consistent eye contact. And there's something freeing about that. And so I've had parents say, I've encouraged parents, take a drive, even if you have nowhere to go, figure out someplace that's 45 minutes away, drive there for whatever fake errand that you need, and start your conversation in the car, either there or on the way back, and see if you can get some information. Ask them to help you make that salad and hand them a cutting board and the tomatoes and say, chop these for the salad. And sometimes that is actually particularly helpful because it gives you that distraction. And all you have to say, in my opinion, is, I love you completely, no matter what. You can tell me anything. I want you to be safe and happy and healthy. And I've noticed that you've been down or worried a lot recently. How can I help? And sometimes just that invitation, just noticing them, like physically tuning in to their person and saying, you're off your baseline, and I'm your parent and I want you to be okay, and you're not, and what can I do to help? is all that they're waiting for. So that invitation, like you're talking about, Steve, just to have that dialogue, and to feel seen. Because I also think that depression and anxiety can be
Mm.
very isolating. It can just be so deflating. You said that word earlier, and that's such a perfect word. It sort of just kicks the life out of you. And so for somebody to say, I see you down, and I see you struggling, how can I help? Sometimes is all it's going to take.
I love
Um,
that.
Good. And maybe for you as a high schooler, that may have been the approach that somebody took with you, one of your teachers who came to you and said, hey, I'm seeing this, and you're not yourself. So what can we do? May have been all the invitation that you needed to just get started speaking.
Yeah, I mean that's so spot on. It's almost eerie, but I mean it is. It was really a couple of teachers who it, I don't know that they necessarily use the words I see you in quite the way that you, but 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 sometimes the most powerful emotions are conveyed without using those words.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen the movie Avatar,
Yes.
um, uh,
It's been a while.
okay, so this $1 billion plus movie,
Right.
but one of the key things that stood out for me in the movie, um, and it sounds really silly, and it's been a while for a lot of people, but the way that the people in this fictional alien race, at least alien with respect to human beings, the way that they say "I love you" to each other is "I see you,"
Mm,
and so I just to reiterate what you said, and these are Jen's words, and so she deserves all.
oh,
I mean,
stop
like,
it.
but because this is powerful here is I love you completely, no matter what. I want you to be safe and happy and healthy. And I've noticed that you've been down or worried a lot recently. How can I help?
Hmm.
You can never say that enough times. When I
Right.
say you, I mean, like, I'm talking to myself, as I know my 5-year-old and 4-year-old are out there, and someday they're going to be 15, 16,
Yep.
17,
Yep.
but there is never a bad time. I think you can never go wrong in saying that.
For sure. The other thing that I would add is being in contact with your child's doctor. Some of the kids have transitioned out of pediatrics into the family practice, and that's fine. Whichever doctor they see most regularly, I think it's very important to make sure that they're involved in that conversation as well, because I do think that some of the symptom monitoring and some of the treatment options are going to need sort of that monitoring from a medical perspective. So making sure that you've connected with your provider. And that's the other thing, is that as parents, because they're still minors, you still can make decisions for them, even if they fight you on it. And it's non-negotiable. You have to see the doctor. And sometimes insurance plans require a checkup every year. And sometimes you have a way you can navigate through the rigmarole of saying, we're doing this, whether you want to or not. Because again, the energy required to muster up, get up, get dressed, get showered, go to the doctor, and then once you're there, openly disclose about how you're feeling when it's not great. It's a lot. That's a big ask for a lot of kids. It's going to sap their energy for the rest of the day potentially, and in some cases
Mm.
maybe the week. But it's still worth it to have those conversations and to make sure that the doctor is involved and is knowledgeable about what's happening with your student. And then, of course, we want you to call us at Ridgewood. So we have the advisory model at Ridgewood, and it's, in my opinion, one of the best decisions that we've done in more recent years by assigning our group of students to a particular adult for the duration of sophomore through senior year. Freshmen have their introductory advisory, and then they transition into their permanent advisory. And what happens is we get a great baseline on all of our kids because we see them 5 days a week. And so that collaboration with your student's advisor is going to be very key as you start to look for changes from their baseline. And simply calling and saying, or emailing the advisor and saying, I am concerned. what have you noticed from the school perspective? Advisors can push out emails to teachers. How's their attendance been? How's their participation in class? Are they turning stuff in? What's their discipline history look like? We have access to a lot of information. And then from there are other people within the structure at Ridgewood. Our Dean of Students, Mr. Hawk, is very involved in kids who are off their baseline because of attendance or because of their behavior. Our nurse deals with a lot of kids with psychosomatic stuff sometimes. You know, there's a persistent headache or a persistent stomach ache, which is very valid. It's very real, but it's interesting because it always seems to time in conjunction with English or with AP Computer Science principles or whatever the class is that might be causing the stress. So Candace Reed is our nurse, and she's phenomenal at noticing kids and seeing them, right, and tracking their baseline. We have 2 counselors in the building, Jim and Carrie, who work with our juniors and seniors. Katie Davis works, and I have a slide coming up later I'll show you. Katie Davis works with freshmen and sophomores. And I'm super lucky to work at Ridgewood High School because we actually have 3 full-time social workers for our student population, which is pretty phenomenal given our size. So I'm Jen Snyder, and I work with the the sophomores and juniors. Justina Kaputska works with our freshmen, and Kathleen Lanus works with our seniors. And so you have dedicated people at every level who are ready to help your kids with whatever challenges that they're facing.
May I
Yeah, of
add to
course.
that? Okay. And here I'm going to speak from the classroom teacher's
Please.
perspective, as well as an advisor. I have worked at 4 different high schools. I hold no secret that I want to retire. Even as I'm speaking at 41 years old, I want to retire at Ridgewood High School. I really do love this place. But I have to back that up with more than words. It's really there are so many there are so many ways that I see adults rethinking how to do school in a way that serves everybody. Well, the advisory model was something, I'll be honest, my first year. I don't think I had a good grasp on what my role was as a teacher and as an advisor. And after having time to really absorb it and learn what it is, many high schools have freshman advisories and homerooms and things like that. This is not a new concept, but what makes Ridgewood's unique is that even though I'm not a clinician, I'm a computer scientist, mathematician, whatever by trade. But ultimately I'm a teacher of students. I teach I teach computer science, but I teach students computer science. So it's the students first. Even though I'm not a clinician, I have a role in being, as an advisor, someone who, I don't want to say counselor because I don't want to disrespect somebody who's a licensed counselor or say the wrong term, but I have an awareness of where the students are, and I'm a liaison and an available liaison between parents and guardians, teachers, student support services staff, and administration. And it's a really wonderful thing to be able to have that extra role. This
Absolutely.
year, I mean, this year, for instance, sending out letters weekly to every family on student performance
That's great.
with the office hours. We're training freshmen to start to develop those skills of being proactive. And if I have time to just throw one other thing in,
Of course.
the there's just as I've spoken before about an issue that I don't think is unique to men.
Mm-mm.
It's definitely not unique to men, but I think men do tend to internalize things more than we probably should. And again, the same could be said for everybody, but this has been a long-standing thing for us, this strong, silent, and suffering thing. And so with that, as a high schooler, as a younger As an adolescent male, there might be even more resistance out of fear of looking poor,
Sure.
me. Um, and so the idea of confidentiality is something that's taken very seriously at Ridgewood.
Hmm.
And, you know, the information that, um, you know, whatever teachers are shared with between the student services staff, it's well understood that, you know, information is shared on a very confidential basis, out of respect for the students' psychological, emotional, social safety.
Absolutely. You
So,
know,
yeah.
in terms of confidentiality, in fact, if we're sharing anything with a staff member, it's because the student and their parent have given us permission to do that. So, in regards to confidentiality, that's a great segue, actually. What we talk about with kids is confidential. It's kept private between the provider and the student. So, the social worker and the counselor and the nurse and the student. And there are three exceptions to the confidentiality rule where we do report something that we've heard. One is harm to self, one is harm to somebody else, and the last one is harm to them if somebody else is hurting them. If it's not one of those three things, then a student can trust that the information that they share with us is going to stay confidential unless they ask us to disclose something to somebody in particular. So it's very often where I'll end up sending an email to staff and say, you have this student in your class in one of your periods who's struggling with a medication adjustment. I just made that email last week, actually. Please be patient while they navigate that shift in meds and the subsequent side effects. And so things like that are going to be collaboratively decided. And beyond that, it will stay confidential with our office. Same goes when we talk with parents. If parents call and they have concerns, I don't want families to feel nervous that we're going to have divulged that information. And our teachers, to their absolute credit, these are not conversations that are happening when we're not pandemic in the faculty cafeteria. Our staff is very careful about the information that they are privy to and do a lot to really caretake for our families and our students in particular. Um, so again, the stress here is, we want you to reach out to your student. We also want you to reach out to the pediatrician and then to us at school so that we can work
Hmm.
together as a part of that team. I do want to talk a little bit about caretaking, the role as parents and the toll that can take. What we know is that a student who lives in a family where there's a genetic component of mental health concerns is almost 5 times more likely to develop that concern themselves. So if grandma or mom or great aunt, has a history with depression, you can almost look for those symptoms to occur on a almost 5 times more likely basis. And so when our students see the adults in their lives caretaking themselves and seeking help when they're struggling, then it gives them permission. It sets the expectation that we seek help when we're struggling. And I often say to students and to their parents, if we were talking about cancer right now, if the medical condition was cancer, would we wait to see if it goes away? Would we wait to see
Mm.
if it's a phase? Would we wait for any reason? And most of the time, I can't even think of a time when somebody said no to me. I mean, the answer is an immediate yes. Of course, we would seek help. We would go right now and find the best specialist we can to treat our student. And so I would argue that mental health is so much more common than cancer in an adolescent's life. And so if you're willing to do it for the mental health or for the cancer example, then we want you to be as equally willing to do it for the mental health stuff in yourself and in your student. Because that role modeling really gives them permission then to ask for that help when they need it.
Mm.
And again, I just wanted to remind people that sometimes the average is 11 years between the onset of symptoms and then seeking help for the first time. And the amount of productivity, the amount of life, and the amount of experience and just everything that you lose when you live with an untreated mental health condition is awful. I mean, if you think about just the wasted energy and the wasted time, and being able to get a job and maintain a job and those kinds of things. And even people who are functional and are able to do those things, but are doing it while they're depressed or anxious, think about the quality of life that they could have if they had gotten help sooner. So that's just something to sort of re-emphasize, that importance of paying attention for those symptoms and then responding appropriately. And, we wanted to, again, flip that narrative about admitting that you are struggling is a sign of weakness. I would actually argue that just given the amount of energy required to even just reach up and look up and say, please help me, is exhausting. And it actually takes superhuman strength sometimes to acknowledge that you're struggling and you're suffering and that you need that help. So,
may I throw? Yeah, because I guess I want to say one other part about that. That this isn't. There's really two parts to changing that mental health narrative, as I see it. Is one, yes, for anybody, however you identify as a person, I mean, like acknowledging is the first major step. But then reaching out and doing what at times will be work. I mean, I volunteer as a co-facilitator for an organization that runs some of these men's retreats that I alluded to earlier. Go up to Lake Geneva and whatnot. A lot of it is about learning how to communicate with the people who are currently in your life by working through some of your history, looking at yourself with a critical lens, and they frame it as work. So that whole notion about getting out of bed, and that it can feel like a monumental task. Absolutely. It's why, frankly, at some of these weekends, they specifically have people go 2-3 hours away from Chicagoland. They make people leave their phones and their watches in the car, and they have their cars parked away from eyesight pretty much throughout the retreat. That's not meant to scare people away, but that's the reality of it, is that if you're going to do the work, you got to do the work. And, so they try to disable it. But, the work, when you get to the other side, there's good stuff. My brother died this is really what I want to say, Jen, is that my brother died in a motorcycle accident. And, my mom was devastated. My dad was devastated. We have a relatively small family. And this was a man who, at 43 years old, had taken quite a few risks in his life. We were starting to think that maybe he was superhuman. He wasn't. And I miss him to this day. But at the end of for many months, I couldn't ride a motorcycle. And I got over that part of it because, as you said, quality of life, Jen. I came to believe, and this is, who knows what the truth is, and this isn't necessarily the focus of this parent university, but I have a belief that he would want me to still enjoy riding a motorcycle. I wear a helmet. I'm very careful in how I ride, but I go to school. I go right down Montrose. I've parked the bike there many times, and if anything, I've come to see that it's somewhat of an honor to my brother, as opposed to feeling like it was a trigger. Sure. So that's what, when we say quality of life, that's what came up to mind for me. So yeah. I appreciate you letting me.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think that you hit on a really important thread, though, about risk-taking and what we know about adolescents without a fully developed brain yet. Their frontal lobe, which is responsible for decision-making, troubleshooting, some of the bigger kind of brain functions, won't fully develop until they're probably 25. 23 to 27 is kind of the average, they say, is that adolescents, when they're feeling overwhelmingly big, difficult feelings, find their own ways to cope. And so it can be positive, what we call adaptive coping. And that would be things like seeing your doctor, talking with a social worker, joining a gym, for example, to get some physical exercise or activity, or maybe you take up martial arts, or you start writing poetry or playing the guitar, or even in your case, riding your motorcycle, right?
Hmm.
Obviously not our teenagers yet, but
No.
as you get older, finding some sort of adaptive and healthy way to cope with those feelings. And without those skills, what we know is that adolescents will find other ways to cope that are considered maladaptive. And what we see is often it's tobacco use. They're vaping on the Juuls, or their e-cigarettes. They're using drugs. Sometimes it's weed, and sometimes it's bigger, more heavy, scary stuff like Xanax bars, things that they can find in the medicine cabinet or buy from their friends. They're misusing their ADHD medication,
Hmm.
or their cocaine or meth or whatever they can get their hands on. Sometimes it's promiscuity in relationships because they don't have any self-respect for themselves or for other people, and so they are taking risks with their sexual activity. We see kids who self-injure. We see kids who drink a whole lot to the point of blacking out, and really scary, dangerous decisions. And so there's a whole host of ways that kids will cope with their bad feelings if we don't help them find healthy ways to do that, and they will be maladaptive. So again, you can also sort of extrapolate that if there's an 11-year gap on average between symptom onset and seeking help, it's easier to understand why we have the substance abuse issues in the United States the way that we do, because people have a long history of coping with bad feelings maladaptively. So again, the earlier that we can see our kids and acknowledge their suffering and help them through that, I think the more productivity and the better quality of life everybody will have as a result. So one of the things we promised about this workshop was this idea of self-awareness and self-management. So I don't need to belabor this, and we don't have to take forever, but I do think it's important, as you're sort of noticing those symptoms as they start to appear, to just keep a track. It can be on your phone, it can be in a little notebook, because you're looking for patterns. And very often medical providers are going to say things like, because again, with the diagnosis, how long has this been going on? So for depression, we're looking for 2 weeks, and for anxiety, we're looking for 6 months. And we want to make sure that we've kind of documented what that looks like, and those symptoms, and that intensity and duration and frequency. And then in terms of self-management, I like to stress this idea of whole person wellness. And Steve has really done a great job from which with one of the areas that's a little bit more tricky, which I always call that sort of spiritual, emotional wellness. And this idea about unplugging, going to Lake Geneva on a retreat with other people who are like-minded, and leaving your phone and your watch in the car and really dialing in on yourself. There's a million versions of that kind of stuff. It can be sitting outside every day. And in pandemic, so many people are so fearful about being outside. But I say to all of my kids, if you are outside and you are 10 feet from somebody else, you can safely breathe fresh air and rejuvenate your body outside of the kind of stale air of your bedroom. But also, we need you to be thinking about mindfulness. And mindfulness is not something, it doesn't have to be, what did my friend call it? Like hippy dippy hoodoo voodoo stuff. It can be as simple as just closing your eyes. And there's a million apps, there's the Calm app and the Breathe app and the Headspace app. Any of those offer a free trial, and you can bump around, and use up the free trial on all of them and find a guided meditation. If you Google search on YouTube, or YouTube search guided meditation, there's 400 things that'll pop right up, and you can pick one that sounds interesting. So that's sort of the mindfulness meditation. Something as simple, and I use this with my son actually. It's a grounding technique for when the anxiety is pretty high. It's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So what's 5 things that we can see right now? Stop where we are. What can we see? 4 things we can hear. 3 things that we can feel. 2 things that we could smell, and 1 thing that we can taste. And so if we are doing this at bedtime, often it could be we taste toothpaste because we just brushed our teeth. So it's really trying to tune into your physical body and kind of turn off the headspace noise that's a little distracting. You can also try to move your tongue inside of your mouth without it touching any of your teeth, which is actually more tricky than you might imagine. Some of you are probably trying it right now.
I am.
That's a mindful technique. And the idea that you give yourself something else to focus on and think about, even for 30 seconds, can be that relief that you need from that relentless stream that sometimes is toxic and kind of gets stuck in our heads. And of course, breathing. The number one way that you can reset yourself is to take 5 deep breaths or 10 deep breaths, or just keep deep breathing until you start to feel better. I learned from one of my science colleagues, Miss Labenstein, that in the time it takes to do 5 deep inhales and exhales, your blood in your body goes through, it does 1 rotation through your body. So I like to tell kids that with 5 deep breaths, you get a reset. Like you've completely reoxygenated your entire body.
That's awesome.
Isn't that awesome? Like you can just reset anytime you need to with 5 breaths. And so I think that sometimes just offering our kids ways that they can control what feels out of control to them often is one of the ways that you can address whole body wellness, but like whole person wellness. Did I forget anything, Steve?
No. Just one last little thing. My grandfather was a World War II second wave Normandy veteran. He had I have pictures of him in a boat about ready to land on shore, and he ended up with a Purple Heart and 4 Bronze Stars.
Wow.
He lived to 91 years old. I didn't learn about the vast majority of what I just said until maybe the last 5 to 10 years of my life. He died about 8 years ago, so he didn't start divulging much of what
Right.
happened in the war because, out of his words, when the war was over, the war was over. They didn't call it PTSD at that time; they called it shell shock.
Right.
And when I speak of strong, silent, and suffering, this is a man who absolutely would have you know nothing about his experience in World War II. He was as brave of a veteran as I would. He was a very brave veteran, but I saw secondhand and experienced thirdhand some of the trauma that he lived in his life
Sure. Yeah.
through depression. And my invitation for anybody who can hear me, wherever this goes in recording, just think about undoing that cycle for your own children.
Yep.
That's what
Absolutely.
I would end with. So I
Absolutely.
think you had a closing of this.
Nope, that's all. I've just put up the slide for the contacts of our student services people. And if you need help from any one of us, please reach out. And then I believe that the presentation will be posted along with the video. But I wanted to just note, I pulled some of our stats and our information from different resources. So it's like I just pulled this out of my head. I actually looked it up and made it as part of our presentation today. And that is it. We thank you for your time and being a part of it. And we look
Yeah.
forward to collaborating with you guys and your kids in the future. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Steve.